Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ramadan Mubarak. Welcome to this amazing series of Dawah Made Easy. As we promised in our last episode that we'll be discussing something about the moon sighting or the moon fighting, which happens across the Muslim Ummah. And in this particular episode, the purpose is not to ignite a fight or to debate and to go out and burst someone up, but it's just to bring an academic forum and information for those Muslims who are not aware of what is moon sighting and what is calculation and all those things around this particular issue. So today we have with us Brother Waseem Razvi from IRA. Welcome to the show, Brother Waseem. So as you are aware that there is issues happening around this time in terms of moon sighting and all those related issues. So we have certain questions where we want to ask you, and inshallah we can get some answers for the Muslims so they can understand and follow it in a more better way. To begin with, what is the Sunnah way of starting Ramadan?
Right. Well, while we are talking about Ramadan and moon, it is very important we see that there is some mention of moon in the Quran itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah number 2, ayah number 189, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the query that the people ask. Allah says that they ask you concerning the new moon. So they ask you concerning the moon, the hilal. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches the Prophet to tell them that this is for the calculation or for counting the days, for counting for the people to go to Hajj and other countings. So meaning that the purpose of moon, one of the purposes of moon being there in the sky is that you are able to count it so that you can set up your fixed terms, your months throughout the year. That's one of the major purposes of the moon being available there. Now that is what is mentioned in the Quran. Now in regards to starting the month of Ramadan is one of the conditions of it, as stated by the Prophet ﷺ, and this is a very, very popular hadith. And this hadith has various chains. It is mentioned across various books of hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ said specifically, do not start fasting until you sight the moon, and do not stop until you sight the moon. And similar wordings are found in different hadith. What it means is there is a condition being specified here that fasting begins with the month of Ramadan, and the month of Ramadan begins with the sighting of the moon. So the Prophet is specifically said, sight the moon and begin the month of Ramadan, sight the moon and stop fasting or break your fast. So what here, the Arabic word used here is ru'ya. So the crescent, the sighting of the crescent, the sighting of the new moon. We know how tiny it is. It's quite a struggle. A couple of million people try to sight it, and hardly one or two or a few get the opportunity to sight it. So the sighting of the moon happens to be the condition for the beginning of the month of Ramadan and the end of the month of Ramadan, and it is the same case for the beginning and end of each month throughout the lunar calendar. That is the process of it.
So from what we can understand is that moon is the main criteria to start and end the month of Ramadan.
That's right, yes.
But around this moon sighting, I think it's pretty much every year that people, they abuse each other. Some they go to extreme lengths in calling out names and stuff like that. So what is this fuss around moon wars?
Right. So well, at times we see that instead of moon sighting, we end up calling it moon fighting because of the amount of arguments and debates that are happening there. Now, probably we're not sitting here to just end the whole debate that is out there. But what we want to try do in this discussion is to bring forward the information so that people are aware, in other words, educated to deal with this subject. So why are there moon fightings, and what you use the other term moon wars? So pretty much every Ramadan we have this moon war. Now, willingly or unwillingly, many of the people do get involved into this. So we'll discuss what brings up this discussion, what brings up this debate. The first reason is there are different opinions amongst the scholars in regards to the criteria for the sighting of the moon. That is why you have different opinions. Because of the different opinions, you have people celebrating or starting or ending the month of Ramadan differently in different parts of the world. And because of that, at times, it happens that people end up discussing, debating, arguing, and which ends up in moon fighting, you can call. And before the month comes, then there is a whole fear out there, and there is a fear of this moon war about to happen. Now, as I said, the basic reason why it happens is because there are different opinions. What are these opinions? There is one opinion that if a moon is sighted anywhere in the world, everybody is obliged to follow the sighting. Because of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, start the fasting with the sighting of the moon. Sight the moon and start the fasting. So the scholars who are of the opinion of global sighting, they say this sighting means any sighting by anyone in any part of the world. So it's the same hadith which is used and understood differently by different group of scholars. So one group of scholars says this hadith clearly means any sighting. So if anybody sights in say South America, you living in Australia or in the Middle East, you're going to be following that. That is one opinion. The other group of scholars, they say, well, no, see, unless and until you are falling in the same region or you're falling in the same night. So this is what you term as regional sighting to some extent. So what they say is, no, if your night is beyond the night of the other country, for example, if somebody is going to sight moon in Australia, which is say 15 to 17 hours ahead of United States of America, by the time you sight the moon and you let them know, it's going to be 15 hours of time difference. Or say the other way, America sights the moon and by the time Australia, it will be 9 a.m. the next morning. So you probably have to either start fasting half a day, half in middle of the day, or you have to break the fast middle of the day. So in either case, they say regional sighting is the opinion, and they take exactly the same hadith. They say fast when you sight the moon and break the fast when you sight the moon. Then there is a third opinion, which says that you go with the local sighting. So it means that sight the moon where you are. So this also use exactly the same hadith, and they say that it is local sighting. So you sight the moon in your country, in your city, in your locality, and you go with that. The sighting of the moon in another region, in another country, in another part of the world is not obliged. You're not obliged to follow that sighting. So these are three major opinions amongst the scholars across the globe. That is the global, followed by the regional, and followed by the local sighting. So because of these different opinions, that is why you see some sort of disagreement amongst the community.
So having understood these three different opinions, how should a Muslim approach these three opinions? Because not every Muslim is educated enough to understand all the three different opinions. So how should a lay Muslim deal with these different opinions?
Right. Well, I think this is a very, very important point, and I think this is the reason that we are probably discussing this subject. The whole idea, the whole purpose of this discussion is so that we are aware of the idea, of the subject, of the opinions, and we can respect each other. Yes, the difference is going to remain, but the whole concept is that as Muslims, as brothers in the month of Ramadan, we can understand each other and appreciate each other and respect each other's opinion. Now, why do we need to respect these opinions? What are these opinions? Where do these emanate from? Where do these opinions come from? Is it that the scholars in 21st century have come up with these opinions? Or is there some sort of backing all the way back to the Salaf, all the way back to the companions of the Prophet ﷺ? Now the Prophet ﷺ mentioned certain ahadith directly, specifically to the sighting of the moon. There has been situations where the Prophet ﷺ was informed of a sighting by a person, and the Prophet ﷺ accepted the sighting and he commanded everybody to fast. There have been a situation where somebody from outside the city of Medina entered the city of Medina and he said, I sighted the moon the last night. And the Prophet ﷺ inquired, obviously, are you a believer? Read the Shahada, the cross verification of that. And once the person verified, the Prophet ﷺ said to everyone to fast. The point being mentioned here is usually there are two witnesses required for the crescent sighting. But in this case, when a person came from outside the city of Medina and the Prophet inquired him being a believer, the Prophet immediately accepted the sighting without much query, without asking the distance, without asking where exactly he sighted the moon, what was the shape of the moon, did he come from another country, another city. The Prophet was not interested in those details. The Prophet ﷺ immediately acknowledged the sighting and declared the fasting based on that. Now this shows that the Prophet ﷺ accepted the sighting of the moon. So this was one main criteria. Now, based on this, the scholars argue and have different opinions. One group of scholars says that this is the proof for the sighting of a global moon, because the Prophet ﷺ was in Medina, which is an entire country at that time, and somebody came from outside the country into the borders of the country, and the Prophet was least bothered about the distance, the timing, the location, whether he came from another country. The Prophet did not inquire about this. Was he 80 kilometers away? Was he 120? Was he 200? All of these were not the queries of the Prophet ﷺ. What it means is, so the scholars said, this means that this is a global sighting opinion. The other scholar says that yes, this is quite a good sighting opinion, but this confines it to the region of the Prophet ﷺ. So the second opinion of the scholars, they go with the regional sighting of this opinion. Then you have the third opinion of the scholars which go with the local sighting. They say, well, see, the person who saw the moon had to be in the vicinity of Medina to a certain extent. Okay, he was not inside the borders of Medina, but this person could not come from a far off country. He could not come from, say, Syria or from Iraq. He was probably close to Medina because it was a night ago. So that is around, say, 24 hours of traveling. 24 hours of traveling in those days was hardly today's 2 hours of driving. So they said that this is the hard drive that from Mecca to Medina probably, or some similar distance. So they said this would mean local sighting. So from the same hadith, the scholars draw different rulings, and based on this, they said global sighting, regional sighting, and local sighting. Now, this opinion was seen to have difference even amongst the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So even the companions of the Prophet differentiated amongst themselves basing on this opinion. So some of them went with the global, some of them went with the regional, and some of them went with the local sighting. So this was the opinion which the companions held, which is the difference of opinion. That is what we call ijtihad, a valid difference of opinion amongst the scholars. Who, in this case of ijtihad, which means both sides have evidence. And the evidence comes from the Quran and the Sunnah. So when the evidence comes from there, then you allow the permissible difference of opinion. That is why you call it ijtihad. And that's the reason, even if I, for example, I'm going to go with regional sighting opinion, I would still respect the other opinions because all of these opinions emanate from the Quran and the Sunnah. So it's a valid difference of opinion. And the way the Muslims should be dealing with it is, if the scholars in my city, if the scholars of my country, if the scholars who are the authority in my place, they follow either of this opinion, I have the obligation to go with them. And I have the necessity to respect the other opinions. And believe me, from what I know, I have discussed this matter in detail with the scholars of global sighting, the scholars of the opinion of regional and local. And I've got very good contact with all of them, here in Australia, as well across the globe. Now, the scholars respect each other very much. They are not in a position where they abuse anybody else. They say, this is my opinion, take this, and I believe that the other opinion is weak, but respect it. This is pretty much the wording of any and every scholar I have spoken to, who are the propagators of each of these opinions, who have got societies, organizations set up to declare moon sighting accordingly. But they all are very respectful to each other. So how a Muslim should deal with respect to the other opinion, while they have every right to go with the scholar who follows a particular opinion out of this.
So following up on this this concept of that we should respect each other's opinion, can we say that they all are right or they all are wrong, or some are right and some are wrong? So how can we say this, who is right and who is wrong?
Well, definitely it's a very important aspect, because in Islam we generally tend to see things black and white, right or wrong, halal or haram. But we are also aware in the fiqh, in the jurisprudence of Islam, we are aware that there is something called ikhtilaf, which we call as valid ikhtilaf. As I just mentioned, it's a matter of ijtihad. This is a well-known matter of difference of opinion from the time of the Sahaba. That is why the scholars respect each other's side. So who is right and wrong? There is no right or wrong side in this, because one of the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ in relation to difference of opinion, in relation to ijtihad, in relation to matters of ijtihad, the Prophet said, if you get it right, so out of the two valid opinions, if you get the right one, if this was your opinion, the Prophet said you will get the ajr, you will get double ajr. One for following the sunnah and one for getting it right. The other group of scholars who got it wrong, what is our general perception? We will think they will get the sin. But here the Prophet ﷺ says, this is talking about the ijtihad, the valid difference of opinion matters. The Prophet says, who gets it wrong, they also get at least one ajr. The one ajr for trying to follow the sunnah. They got it wrong, no sin on them, but they tried to follow the sunnah because that is what they understood from the hadith. So as long as they base their evidence on the Quran and the sunnah, according to the opinions of the salaf, and according to the opinions of the great scholars of this ummah, then even if they are wrong, they will be given the ajr. So who is right and wrong? No. In these opinions, everybody is on the same platform. Yes, the stronger opinion is the one with the stronger evidence, much more clearer evidence, much more explicit evidence. And the weaker opinion is still not wrong, but it will still be rewarded. Its opinion might be weak, but to these scholars, this seems to be the stronger, while to the other scholars, that seems to be stronger. That is why they are sticking to their opinion. So for a common Muslim, we should be doing exactly what the scholars do, respect the other opinion, while you have every right to stick to and follow one particular opinion.
Inshallah. But all these things are based on Hadith and the Quran, obviously. And there are, mashallah, 3 different opinions in sighting of the moon. But there's a new problem which I believe arose in the last few decades, if I'm not wrong, and that is called the astronomical calculation. So they kind of use this method to sight the moon or determine the moon. So if you can shed some light on astronomical calculation and whether is it an opinion or not.
Sure. Well, what has happened recently is with the help of latest technology and telescopes and a lot of readings of the astronomy that is out there, the measurements, the calculations out there. So the scholars have come to this point that some have this opinion that when we have so much technology at hand, when we are able to study the birth of the moon and the phases of the moon and the timings of the moon and as well of the sun, obviously. So we are able to study all of this in great detail. So while we are at it, why can't we just calculate the moon? Why can't we just have an astronomical calculation determining the phase of the moon? And based on that, we can declare the beginning of the month and the end of the month throughout the lunar calendar. So now this is something that has recently happened. But interestingly, if we look at this, this was something that was asked even to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet was asked, can't we just calculate? Now let me bring a difference between calculation and counting. Counting is not what we are referring to as calculation. But the question that was asked to the Prophet ﷺ, can't we just calculate? Meaning using some sort of astronomy, because there were astronomers in those days. There were companions of the Prophet ﷺ who would be considered experts of in today's language. They were there. So when it was asked to the Prophet ﷺ immediately responded and he said, we are an unlettered nation. We are an ummah which is an unlettered nation. We do not calculate. So the Prophet ﷺ sort of closed the door of calculation in relation to the sighting of the moon. Because with the sighting of the moon, the condition that is spoken by the Prophet is to sight the ru'ya. The hilal has to be witnessed, has to be sighted. Not that it has to be born, because the Prophet ﷺ, see, if it was a calculation, you would be calculating the birth of the moon or you will be calculating various phases of the moon. But interestingly, the Prophet said, the way to count for Ramadan or for any other month, the Prophet said, on the 29th of Sha'ban, go out and sight the moon. If it is cloudy and you cannot sight the moon, then count until 30, complete the month, and then start fasting. So in simple words, on the 29th of the month, you try to sight the moon. If you sight the moon good, the next morning is the first of the next month, the first of Ramadan. But if you could not sight the moon because it was cloudy or for whatever reason, or it was not visible, then the Prophet said complete the 30 days. That's counting. 29 days, if you can't sight, 30. Finish. But the question that was asked to the Prophet is, can't we just calculate? Because they had the astronomy available at that time and they were able to calculate. So the Prophet refused it. Now, even at the later stage, from the time of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, all the great Aimma of this Ummah, they all had astronomy developing in their ages, in their generation. They did not consider that as part of it. Going further down, all the way up to Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he was even asked about this question and he said there is ijma, there is consensus in the ummah that calculation is not acceptable. Rather, we go with the sighting of the moon, the sighting of the crescent. So this clearly makes it something that it cannot be cross-questioned anymore, because the scholars agreed on it from the time of the Aimma, from the time of the 4 great scholars to the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, and even until the last century. Calculation was never part and parcel of the sighting of the moon, because the problem is the hadith words are absolutely clear. Sight the moon. The moment the wordings of the hadith is absolutely clear and explicit in these terms to sight the ru'ya, then there is not much of the space to really go into the astronomical calculations.
But having talked about calculation, but don't we calculate the timings of the 5 daily
prayers.
salah?
Right. Well, a very interesting question and a very logical one, obviously. As sometimes they call it, the checkmate in the chess game. So people ask this question that while with the astronomical calculations we are rejecting for the moon sighting, why are we accepting the calculations for the sun? Now, interestingly, this is the part there, because the Prophet ﷺ did not say sight the sun for Salatul Fajr, sight the sun for Salatul Duha. The Prophet gave a frame, a workable frame, and he said, this is the frame, this is where you need to pray between this time zone, and that time zone is calculatable, so you can calculate that time. If the Prophet ﷺ did not use the word sight for the moon for the beginning of Ramadan, the Prophet would have said, just go with the moon and start the month of Ramadan, or count or calculate. It would have been different. But because the Prophet specifically said sight the moon, count until 29th, go out and sight if you cannot sight the moon. Now, interestingly, what it means is on the 29th the moon is out, the moon is there, the moon is actually visible, but there are clouds. So the Prophet is saying, if you cannot sight the moon because of the clouds, then count until 30. So what this means is the moon is already out, the moon is born, the moon is visible, but the Prophet said you still have to continue to the 30th day. What this means is by any calculation, even if you are absolutely correct, even if you are perfect in your calculation of the moon, which is questionable, but even if you are, then you cannot take it with Islamic fiqh, because the issue here is the Prophet's obligatory command to sight the moon in spite of the moon being born, in spite of the moon being visible, in spite of the moon being available, but not visible because of the clouds. So that does not allow the space for the calculation to be taken into consideration.
So, as we are living in Australia, but naturally we are more concerned about what's happening in Australia within the Muslim community.
Right.
So, what is, out of these 3 valid opinions, the global, the regional and the local moon sighting, which is more practical in Australia? Because Australia is a huge country and it's also a continent.
Right.
So, once Perth is probably 4,000 kilometers far from Melbourne.
Right.
So, out of these 3 valid opinions, which is more practical for us in Australia?
So as we mentioned earlier, that all these 3 valid opinions, the global, the regional and the local sighting, these are all valid opinions, well respected, acceptable by scholars across the globe. So even while now we are discussing which is more practical and which is more applicable to here in Australia, what we are going to be mentioning now does not nullify any of the respectable things that we have mentioned about all the 3 opinions, because these were the opinions of the companions of the Prophet, based on the sayings of the Prophet, based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So we just do not have the right to abuse, accuse or downgrade any of the other opinion. However, while choosing from within the valid opinions, you have every right to lobby for it, propagate for it, and stress other people, advise other people to adhere or to accept that opinion. Now, in Australia, what happens is we have got people from different backgrounds, people from different opinions. So what happens here is you will always have scholars, masajid, organizations going with each of these opinions. So you'll always have these 3 plus the calculation one. So it is always going to be there. Interesting, just to add a point with the calculation, even with the calculation, there are different opinions. Calculation based on the birth of the moon, calculation based on the possible visibility of the moon across the globe, possibility on the visibility of the moon in your country. So these are 3 different opinions within the calculations. So calculation is not just one fixed thing that you press the button and you know the date. No, calculation will tell you the birth of the moon. Some people go with the birth of the moon. Some people go with the possible visibility anywhere in the world. Some people go with the possible visibility within your own country. So there are going to be different opinions across, even in the calculation. So it's not going to unite people. Now with these 3 opinions, it is all out there. Now what happens here in Australia? Australia is a very different demography. The border of Australia is massive, humongous, as you just mentioned. More than 4,000 kilometers from one end to the other. Massive mainland. 4 time zones. 3 to 4 different time zones across Australia. Interestingly, Australia extends beyond the borders of Australia. There are at least 2 islands of Australia, Christmas Island and Cocos Island, which are part of Australian country, which are part of Australian constitution. The currency of Australia stands there. You don't need a visa as an Australian. You can simply pick up a flight and go there. You don't need a passport to travel there. All of this because they are part of Australia, and one of those two islands is almost at the border of Indonesia, the Cocos Island. And Cocos Island, interestingly, happens to be a Muslim majority island, part of Australia. So while we are here in Australia, now this is the situation, we are at the corner of the world, pretty much. So Australia is far ahead in timing compared to the rest of the world. The sun rises first in New Zealand and Australia and then rises in the rest of the world. So the sun first comes here. So the night first falls with us. So if we are going to be following any other sighting anywhere in the world, we are going to be the ones in a disadvantage. We are going to be finding it out the later, unless we sight it the first. So now, from here, there are scholars who follow the global sighting. From here, the scholars who follow the regional sighting. From here, the scholars who follow the local sighting. What I personally have understood by speaking to the scholars of different opinions, and this is my personal understanding, anybody has every right to disagree. I'm not a scholar by myself. I do not have the right to give a fatwa. But what I'm trying to discuss here is just for my Muslim brothers and sisters here in Australia. What seems to be more appropriate or practical in this situation? If I'm going to be living, I'm giving an example, if living in Brisbane, I follow the scholars who go with the regional sighting, for example. But in Brisbane, all the masajid are going with the local sighting. While I follow the scholar of the regional sighting, while in Brisbane, because all the mosques, or at least the majority of the mosques, are going with the local sighting, so it would be more appropriate for me to go with the local sighting, although I believe regional sighting to be a strong one, for the purpose of unity and brotherhood. As long as it is part of the valid ijtihad, I have every right to choose that opinion. So some scholars do advise that you go with the local scholars if they are in large number or in majority or in absoluteness, then go with them. But if you have the choice, because for example here in Australia you don't have a clear majority on anything in particular. There are scholars who go with the astronomical calculations, and within them, as I said, there are three different groups. One who goes with the birth of the moon, one who goes with the sighting anywhere in the world, one who goes with the visibility possibility in Australia. Then you have these three valid opinions, which is global, regional and local. I personally, when I have done my research and analysis and have spoken to scholars, I felt that the regional sighting seems to be a bit more appropriate for Australia because of its location, its geography and its vastness. As I said, why not local? Because the local sighting opinion scholars, they go with Australian mainland and the borders. Within the border of Australia, whatever is sighted is taken as local. Completely fine, all respect. But why not the islands of Australia? Why don't you take the sighting of the islands of Australia? Because they too are under the flag of Australia. And you have every communication with them. You have every contact with the local imam in that city. And why don't we take the moon of that city? So the answer is not yet confirmed from the other side. So my point here is local is not really local happening. It's not really local in that sense. The other is global. Now, global is across the globe. And as we mentioned earlier as well, for example, there could be a difference of around 15 to 18 to 20 hours of difference. So if somebody else, Australia has the morning, we have already had the night, we've already had the morning, we would be almost like 3 p.m. local time by the time somebody sights the moon somewhere in South America, 20 hours behind us. Are we prepared to break the fast or start fasting at 3 p.m. in the afternoon while we come to know that? I'm not saying this is impossible. All I'm saying is these are certain reasons for which the scholars chose for the regional sighting for the reason. Now the scholars of global sighting might very well say, well, there is nothing wrong in breaking the fast at 3 p.m. or starting to fast at 3 p.m. or fulfilling that fast then at the end of Ramadan, because the Prophet ﷺ did break the fast when a tribe came, a traveling group, entered Medina, and they said they sighted the moon the beginning of the month, a day before the Prophet ﷺ sighted in Medina. So the Prophet was fasting in the day. It was more than half the day was gone. The Prophet broke the fast and he said, today is the day of Eid. So the Prophet broke the fast and he prayed the Eid Salah the next day. This means that you can break the fast. So the global sighting opinion scholars say you can always break the fast and go with the global sighting. So I'm not denying it. All I'm saying is the more practical one seems to be regional sighting for this reason, because of the size of Australia, because of the geography of Australia, and because of the location of Australia.